here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Venice, Italy, the site of the Venice Biennale, the oldest, most prestigious international biennial art exhibition in the world. It's 120 years old. We're broadcasting from the Creative Times Summit here in the Arsenale. It's an area of Venice, yes, the old arsenal. On Tuesday, the summit featured a public discussion between Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and his daughter, the acclaimed artist Mariam Ghani, who is based in Brooklyn, New York. Well, Mariam Ghani joins us today. For over a decade, she's worked on a number of art projects looking at how the United States responded to the September 11th attacks. Along with the artist Chitra Ganesh, Ghani created an index of the disappeared, a physical archive documenting post-9/11 detentions, deportations, and renditions. Ghani and Ganesh also created the Guantanamo Effect, an interactive digital archive defining, illustrating, and linking key terms and events in the so-called global war on terror. Mariam Ghani is also a member of Gulf Labor Working Group. Mariam, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
It's really my pleasure, Amy.
It was quite a scene yesterday here. Now, everyone appears in person, but I understand that the reason your co-panelist wasn't also here is well, you can tell us.
Well, it's a bit difficult for him to come to Venice without also bringing a whole infrastructure of security personnel with him, which would have quite changed the character of the Creative Times Summit, I think.
Well, we're talking, of course, about the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, Mariam's father. But your focus in talking with him at an art biennial.
Yes.
Why the president of Afghanistan and you talking about art?
Well, as I said before, and actually we talked about this during our conversation, art is a really powerful space in which to both recover forgotten histories and to imagine possible futures that don't resemble the present as we know it. And I think both of those things are incredibly important to Afghanistan today. And I think Afghanistan's artists should be encouraged to play that role and to play it to a much greater extent than they have so far.
So let's talk about the kind of work you've been involved with. I'd like to start with the Guantanamo Effect. Explain what you're doing.
Well, Index of the Disappeared, my collaboration with Chitra Ganesh, has been running for 11 years. And it's both a physical archive, as you mentioned, of detentions, deportations, renditions, and redactions, and also a platform for related interventions around ideas and issues that are contained in the documents that we archive. We do visual interventions, and we also organize discussions and public dialogues. We have been archiving declassified documents, first-person testimony, other artist projects, and all kinds of other material around these issues for a long time now. And in the course of that archival project, we've acquired a lot of kind of arcane expertise in a number of different things.
Now, you are linking what happens in U.S. prisons with what happens in U.S.-run prisons abroad, whether we're talking Guantanamo or Afghanistan. Talk about what you found.
Yeah, the Guantanamo Effect, the interactive project we made for Creative Time Reports, grew out of this phenomenon that we noticed in the course of archiving for Index of the Disappeared, which is that both ideas, policies, and personnel circulated among all the different U.S.-run prisons in the world. So first you have U.S. corrections officers and U.S. policemen who are deployed as military police to Afghanistan when they're called up in the National Guard Reserves. So they end up in Abu Ghraib, they end up in Bagram, they end up in other temporary holding facilities that are prisons in forward operating bases.
You had, for example, Charles Grainer, who ultimately went to jail, the guard at Abu Ghraib, who was known for his brutality in Pennsylvania prisons.
Exactly, yeah. Their records were not examined before they were put in these positions.
And he's the famous one who took pictures with
exactly, yes.
Tortured prisoners.
You have the well-known incident incident at Bagram in 2002 when 2 detainees died, and they died specifically as a result of what are called peroneal strikes, which is a technique that's taught to U.S. police departments to subdue prisoners who are resisting arrest. It's a strike that's applied with the point of the elbow. It's supposed to be applied only to the thighs, but in the case of the prisoners at Bagram, Dilawar and Habibullah, the peroneal strikes were applied to their entire bodies, and they were applied not when the prisoners were in motion resisting arrest, but when they were actually suspended in a hanging position and left there for more than 24 hours, which caused blood clots to circulate through their bodies and led them to die of stroke.
Dilawar was a taxi driver who the U.S. authorities imprisoned
on false evidence. Yes.
And killed.
Yes.
And, I mean, how many times was his body hit?
His body was hit over 100 times, and this was revealed in an internal Army investigation. The MPs involved, the military police involved in the incident themselves testified in the internal Army investigation that they hit him just to hear him cry Allah because they thought it was funny. So that's why they kept hitting him.
Repeat that, please.
They said, we hit him just to hear him cry Allah, Allah, because it's so funny. It was so funny when he did it.
I remember the descriptions of his body, of his muscles.
The bruises all over his body, but especially all along his thighs and his torso.
His muscles shredded by these beatings.
The internal muscles were shredded when they did the autopsy, yeah.
And this practice coming from U.S.?
It came from, a technique that was taught in U.S. police departments, although it was misapplied. It was applied in a way I don't think it was ever intended to be applied, but it's typical of the way that these techniques and personnel circulated into these other theaters of war and then were, I don't want to say refined, but were transformed into something else. And then those same personnel then circulated to other theaters. So actually the same regiment of MPs who were at Bagram then were transferred to Abu Ghraib without, any, this is basically before the investigation at Bagram was completed, the regiment was transferred to Abu Ghraib. And, these policies, without really being examined or controlled, continue to kind of mushroom and develop. And ultimately what happens is that the policies, the techniques, and now even the equipment, the military equipment, circulate back into the U.S., into our domestic sphere.
What about the issue of accountability? You're not only an Afghan woman, you're the daughter of the president of Afghanistan. The issue of accountability.
Yeah.
In the United States, if you beat someone to death like this, of course you're supposed to be charged with murder.
Yes, that's very true. And one of the problems with that kind of accountability in these military theaters of war, and theater I think is a good term to use when talking about them, is that often they're structured by diplomatic agreements concerning the territory on which these prisons are set up. Or often the prisons are taken over from prisons that were previously operated by the very regimes which the U.S. has placed the intervention to topple, to replace, and then they actually take over the same prison that was used by that previous regime without thinking through the implications of using that kind of space and all of its ghosts, which come back and haunt those halls and basically create these repetitions of the same practices. We saw this in Abu Ghraib, which was one of the prisons of the previous regime in Iraq, and we saw this in Pul-e-Charki in Afghanistan, which was one of the most notorious prisons of the communist regime. But the diplomatic agreements basically structure these geographical territories such that there is no accountability in the local space, in the host country, for any acts that are performed on that specifically delineated territory, because it is basically a small sovereign zone of exception to local law.
Do you think this should be changed?
I think it would be fantastic if it were changed. I think it's something that will be very difficult to change in places where those agreements are already in place. But it's certainly something that any countries that are entering into these sorts of agreements in the future should be very careful about in terms of how they structure those agreements, because you don't know what exactly you're going to let yourself in for in the future.
And then talk about what happens here in the United States.
Yeah, so we've really been seeing this in the last few years in particular. It's become extremely visible with the recirculation of military surplus equipment from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan into domestic police departments and even into school police departments through the MRAP program. But we saw this extremely visibly in Ferguson, in Missouri, the use of riot gear that actually came from the military surplus equipment and created these extraordinarily shocking images that looked like war in a domestic space, that looked like a foreign war in a domestic space. But there are much less visible things happening as well, especially in our prison system in the U.S. And one of the most important ones is the creation of the CMUs, or Communication Management Units, especially in Indiana and Illinois, Marion, Illinois, and Terre Haute, Indiana. So these are basically extreme exemplars of solitary confinement, where not only the body is physically confined, but also all communication is diminished and managed to such an extraordinary extent that it is severely limiting to all speech. And it's intended to limit political speech and political activism, political organizing in prison and outside prison as well. It's often applied to prisoners who were activists in one way or another, or who are Muslim. But what it has ended up being used for in many cases is limiting organizing in prison as well, much the way that ADSEG, administrative segregation, or traditional SHUs, solitary housing units, have been used in the California prison system, for example, with the Pelican Bay State case being one of the most significant examples of that.
And the connection with Pelican Bay.
Yeah, it's actually the same lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights, Alexis Agatha-Claes, who is representing the hunger strikers at Pelican Bay State in their case against the excessive use of solitary confinement and the political use of solitary confinement, especially the use of gang classification against people who are political activists, to put them into administrative segregation. And he's also representing most of the plaintiffs in cases against the use of CMUs, both for political activists and for people who have been placed in the CMU just for being Muslim.
I wanted to switch gears, Mariam Ghani, to talk about your work in the Gulf Labor Coalition. There are official posters here, you know, part of the Biennale. And I want to show this for our TV viewing audience, and for radio listeners, you can go online and see. Gulf Labor, who is building the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, Saadiyat Island. It says Guggenheim, Louvre, NYU, recruitment fees, wages, collective bargaining.
Yes.
Talk about what's happening and the activism you're involved with as an artist.
Well, Gulf Labor is a coalition of artists, writers, scholars, curators, architects, and other cultural workers who are organizing to ensure that workers' rights are respected in the construction of these new cultural institutions in the Gulf. And we're particularly concentrated on Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi, where a new cultural zone is being constructed basically from scratch. And it's also part of a larger real estate development project in which the arts are basically being used as one of the luxury commodities of a luxury development. And that's you know, one of the reasons why it's a particular flashpoint. The other is that it's one of those rare moments when artists have real leverage, because one of the projects is a Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, which is an institution that collects contemporary art, and they have a mandate to collect, in this case, contemporary art from and about the Middle East region. So we artists who are part of the producers of this work that is needed to fill this museum felt at the moment when it was first being discussed that we had a chance a chance to use the museum as a kind of lever to create a wider change in the region.
I wanted to turn right now to a quote that we got from the Guggenheim in New York, from Sarah Eaton, Director of Media and Public Relations. She wrote, quote, "As you know, the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi has been a central focus of the Gulf Labor Group, along with the Louvre and NYUAD, that's Abu Dhabi. But of the three, the Guggenheim has yet to be built. The way in which the project is talked about has led to the erroneous perception that the Guggenheim is currently being built in Abu Dhabi under harsh conditions, which is just not true. It's not under construction. The contractor for the construction has not yet been named." Eaton went on to write, "In advance of construction, the Guggenheim has been working closely on the issue with the Tourism Development and Investment Company, which is the developer of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. TDIC has enacted reform on several fronts, including worker accommodation, access to medical coverage, grievance procedures, and retention of passports. The Guggenheim continues to work with TDIC and other authorities and stakeholders inside and outside the UAE to advance progress on conditions for workers who will build the future museum." Your response to that, Mariam Ghani?
Well, all of the infrastructure for the entire Saadiyat Island development project is basically already being constructed. So all of the water, all of the electricity, all of the foundations for the buildings are already being constructed. So it's a bit evasive to say that no construction is being done on the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi site. They haven't contracted the specific contractor for the Ghraib design yet, perhaps, although they have put out bids. They just haven't, selected someone.
Frank Gehry, the architect.
Exactly, for their specific Starchitect building. But there is work being done on the site. So there are workers who are already working.
And you're concerned about what's happening to these workers, whether we're talking about Guggenheim, Louvre, British Museum, Tate Museum.
We're concerned about all the workers in Saadiyat Island, and we're concerned about all the workers more generally in the Gulf who are subjected to the Kafala System.
Which is?
Which is a system whereby you are bound to a sponsor who basically is in control of your right to stay in the country. And this can be especially problematic for workers who have paid a fee to a middleman recruiter to enter the country and are therefore in a debt when they arrive. They're already in debt for several $1,000s when they arrive and are basically working for the first 2 years just to pay off that debt. So they are essentially indentured servants. Their presence dependent on the grace of their kafala sponsor and the length of their visa, which is generally 2 years initially, which is just long enough at current wages to pay off the middleman recruitment debt. It doesn't seem like a very fair system as it stands. We would like to see a real fair working wage. We would like to see workers truly being given the right to organize. As it stands, most often if they organize, they are deported. We've seen this happen over and over again. And we'd like to see these practices that TDIC claims to have put in place, for example, through their EPP, their code of practices for contractors on their site. We'd like to see them actually enforced, because they exist as a code, but they're not actually enforced.
Are you in talks with the Guggenheim directly?
We're always negotiating, and we're always open to conversations. We always say a boycott is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning.
So here your president is, your father's the president of Afghanistan. Have you considered going directly into politics?
No.
Why?
I prefer to work through the space of art. I think for me it's more flexible and it's more interesting.
Well, I thank you so much for being with us. We're going to record a conversation with you after about your project in Ferguson, which is fascinating, the film you made about it. And we'll post it online at democracynow.org. Mariam Ghani, Afghan-American artist based in Brooklyn, New York. Yes, her father is Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. On Tuesday, they took part in a public dialogue with each other here at the Creative Times Summit in Venice. Well, Mariam was here in Venice. President Ghani participated by video stream from Afghanistan. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, well, Secretary of State John Kerry's headed to Cuba to raise the flag on the U.S. Embassy in Cuba Friday. We'll see what a local artist did to break the trade embargo. Well, at least to challenge it. Stay with us.